Why is my daughter laughing?
Get that weird kid and that black waitress away from my table. They are destroying my meal. Those were the first words Julian Devereaux heard the moment he stepped into his own restaurant. Words that may cut through the air. Words that stopped him dead in his tracks long before he comprehended why every throb in his chest suddenly felt incorrect. Julian had come to Devereaux Prime for a regular walkthrough, a basic 5-minute check on the dinner rush, but fate has a way of hiding important events in life when you least expect them. He went in like a rich CEO, calm and sure of himself. He froze as a father who had just experienced the unfathomable. Because just there, standing under the bright lights of the dining hall, wearing an oversized server apron and clutching a silver water pitcher with shaky hands, was his daughter. His 14-year-old daughter, Elara, has autism, the girl who couldn't look people in the eye, the girl who panicked the instant a stranger stepped too close, the girl no one could ever approach without provoking terror. But she was still next to someone, being next to someone at work, smiling next to someone. A young black waitress with a brilliant brown complexion, pulled back hair, and a presence that made you feel like you were wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold night. Naomi was the name on her name tag. She smiled all the time. Her voice was gentle, and Elara, the girl who barely talked beyond a whisper, was talking to her as if they had known each other for a long time. Julian felt the ground tilt under his feet. People looked. Some people are curious, some were confused. And some, like the man who had shouted moments earlier, looked appalled by the sight of a black waitress and an autistic girl sharing the same area. It was more than unfair treatment. It was deletion. People wrap them in costly garments and call them preference. This was not simply a moment. It was the beginning of a black story that no one saw coming. If you have ever watched a single second that rewrote all you believed about life, take a breath, stay with me, and observe intently. What happened next transformed not only Julian's life but also the lives of everyone in the restaurant. Elara Devereaux was born into privileged crystal chandeliers, luxury rugs, private chefs, but she lived in a world far removed from touch, sound, and warmth. From the time she was a toddler, it was evident that Elara did not process the world like other children. She wouldn't look people in the eye. When she fell, she didn't cry. She didn't reach out for embraces. In fact, she jumped every time someone got too close. By her 3rd birthday, her diagnosis was confirmed: severe autistic spectrum disorder with sensory sensitivities and delayed speech. For most people, it was just a name. It was a wall for Julian. He tried everything, from therapists to specialists to developmental programs with titles that cost more than most people's mortgages, but nothing could force connection. Elara would sit for hours, humming to herself and marveling at the shadows that danced across the marble floor. She was in a beat that no one else could hear. She couldn't stand loud noises, didn't like unexpected moves, didn't like being touched. Just touching her shoulder may make her lose it. People who didn't know her thought she was spoiled. To some, it was even broken. But to Julian, she was a puzzle that was hard to solve. He wanted to make things better, but he was a man who was used to regulating stock prices, not feelings. Empathy was never a skill he had as a manager. That's how Elara became the girl who couldn't be touched, not by choice, but because of how people treated her. It was always just her and the babysitter at birthday parties. Julian stood behind her with his arms crossed in family portraits, and she glanced off to the side, lost in contemplation. At galas, she'd sit silently with headphones on, while wealthy visitors mumbled things like, "Poor thing," or worse, "Maybe she just needs more discipline." People saw the suit Julian wore, the automobile he arrived in, and the way his daughter didn't speak, and believed she was a quiet embarrassment cloaked in money. But no one saw Elara for who she really was, a girl with depth, with patterns in her thoughts that others would never grasp. She recognized beauty in detail, in repetition, in soft objects, and in calm places. She learned how light flowed through glass. After seeing it once, she could draw a whole city from memory. She just couldn't say hi. Julian didn't know how to get in touch with her. He loved her more than anything else, yet it had become normal for him to love her from a distance. Being close meant screaming, and being in contact meant being scared. So when he saw her that night at the restaurant standing beside a stranger, not only close but smiling, it wasn't just shocking. There was no way. Until that moment, Julian believed she couldn't connect. He wasn't sure who had really been out of reach, Ilara or him. Julian Devereaux didn't become a billionaire by being emotional. He created his empire from the ground up by making tough choices, working hard, and only sleeping when he had to. His restaurants were more than just places to dine. They were emblems of greatness, with every table showing how high he expected them to be. He noticed when a chair was out of place. He changed the bulbs if the light was too warm. That was Julian, smart, demanding, and always in charge. Except for Ilara. Julian buried himself in work after his wife, Mira, died suddenly from an aneurysm when Ilara was only 6. He couldn't handle the silence at home. Couldn't bear the fragrance of lavender from Mira's side of the bed. So he escaped. Into boardrooms, into reports every 3 months, into plans for growth. He opened 2 new restaurants the year Mira died, and both were instant hits. Everyone appreciated his resilience. No one asked about his daughter. He said to himself that he was doing it for her, that the empire was her future, that the money would protect her from a world she could never completely understand. But there was a truth behind that explanation that he didn't want to face. It was simpler to learn how to deal with markets than to deal with his own sadness or hers. He recruited the greatest people to take care of him, nannies who could speak 3 languages, therapists who have learned about the latest autism studies, teachers who brought framed diplomas and letters of recommendation with them, and when none of them stayed longer than 6 months, he didn't wonder why. He just put new ones in. Julian ran his home like he ran his business, with a focus on results. He measured progress in measures. Today, Ilara ate. This week, Ilara didn't scream. Ilara was outside for 5 minutes. But he completely overlooked the spaces in between, the loneliness, the minor setbacks, the subtle indicators that his daughter wasn't simply autistic, she was severely lonely. And thus, piece by piece, she left his day. He would depart for work before she woke up, come home after she had gone to sleep. She lived in a world behind closed doors, where staff members he rarely talked to took care of things. He wasn't a bad dad. He thought that love was shown by what he built for her, not by what they did together. He never saw the issue, not until that night in the restaurant. He didn't know how happy she was until he saw it on her face. It was the kind of happiness that money couldn't buy. And for the first time, the guy who could see everything in other people recognized how blind he had been to his own child. People often stared at Ilara. In grocery shops, elevators, and the lobby of her father's office buildings. Everywhere she walked, people looked at her. Some were intrigued, some were annoyed, and some were just bewildered. She didn't yell. She didn't hit back. She was just there in her own quiet manner, and for some reason, that was too much for others. She rocked back and forth while she stood in line. She hummed softly when the world felt too loud. She wore headphones to block out the noise, even when there was no music playing, and people looked. But it wasn't the type of attention that made you feel seen. It was the kind that made you feel wrong, not at the right place. Like you were the problem in the room, and everyone else was simply too polite or too uncomfortable to say it. Julian never saw it. He was too busy looking forward to glance around. But for Ilara, every time she left the house was a quiet fight. A fight against gossip. A battle against judgment. Even youngsters at her fancy school treated her like a broken doll, never unkind, just distant. And that was sometimes worse. A woman in a high-end store looked down at her when she was 7 and asked the babysitter, "Is she okay?" Ilara heard it. She always heard it. Her quiet wasn't deafness. It was her way of protecting herself. One time, during a corporate party, she twirled around beneath the lights in the ballroom. It helped her relax. It was the only way she could stay in that room full of noise, suits, and scents. A man in a fitted tux turned to his wife and whispered, "That must be the billionaire's weird daughter." He didn't even attempt to whisper. The laughter that followed wasn't very loud, but it stayed in Ilara's mind for years. So she retreated, deeper and deeper. She stopped asking questions. She stopped trying to get the crayons. She stopped looking anybody in the eye, even the housekeepers. What was the point of being seen if people just thought you were weird? She began to believe what the looks said, started to accept the names, not because they were true, but because they were always there. And so, she lived in the quiet of big rooms, in the shadows of buildings worth billions of dollars. Her world got smaller, in charge, not surprising, more secure. Until Naomi. Until the moment someone looked at her and didn't look away, didn't feel sorry for her, and didn't judge her. Someone who didn't merely watch, but really saw. That was the start of everything for Alara. People often ignored Naomi Ellison, or worse, saw her for all the wrong reasons. She was just 23, but she already knew how to walk through places that were never meant for individuals like her. The workers wore black, and the guests donned diamonds in these rooms, where she emptied $300 bottles of wine but couldn't afford the bus trip home. The darker her skin, the softer she had to speak. Naomi worked as a waitress at Devereaux Prime, which was the crown jewel of Julian Devereaux's enterprise and a high-end restaurant. Every inch of it was designed to impress, from the marble floors to the gold-plated menus. Naomi walked through it like a ghost with a tray. Always there, but never really seen. She smiled even when people said harsh things. She stayed calm as guests waved her over like they couldn't see her until they wanted something. She had heard it all. "You're very articulate for someone from the South." I said, "No, Lemon. Why is it so hard to do what I say? Don't you have someone else who could serve this table? Maybe someone lighter?" Naomi learned early on that being black wasn't a crime in areas like Devereaux Prime, but it did make things harder. One that had to be managed with grace, with composure, and with that ever-present smile. "Sometimes your smile is your only shield," her mother once told her, "so utilize it well." That's what she did, not because she was phony, but because she believed in something better, because there was a heart too huge to harden beneath all that politeness. She liked to watch people. I loved trying to figure out their stories by how they held their forks or talked to the valet. She could remember the pastries that regulars liked most. Not because she had to, but because it made her feel like a person in a profession that frequently made her feel like a robot. What most people didn't realize was that Naomi had formerly studied speech therapy, that she had been the best student in her class before dropping out to take care of her younger brother Elijah, who had a very bad case of autism. She never said anything about it. It seemed too personal and vulnerable for a world that saw her as just another server. But no matter what, Naomi always showed up, never stopped smiling. Deep down, she prayed that one day, maybe not today, maybe not in this restaurant, someone would look past her skin, her apron, and her job and see her. Alara did. And by doing so, they opened up a connection that none of them knew they needed. A connection born not in words, but in presence. That smile was the start of it all. It was supposed to be an easy day. Julian had a quarterly operations meeting at Devereaux Prime, but his assistant got sick at the last minute. The backup nanny had something come up. There was no one else who could help. Julian made a choice that he didn't often make. He took Alara with him. She didn't like being in the car, but she put up with it with headphones and a soft fidget toy. Julian put her in a quiet office upstairs with lots of soft seats and windows that went all the way to the floor. He left her with her sketchpad, her noise-canceling headphones, and a tablet loaded with visual puzzles she enjoyed. He whispered softly, "Just stay here, sweetheart. I won't be gone long." Alara nodded once but didn't say anything. She stared at the window as if it were the most important object in the room. The meeting downstairs went past time. 50 minutes evolved into an hour and a half. Julian's phone was buzzing with updates on contracts, food costs, and requests from investors. One of the security managers walked into the room while he was still talking. He looked pale and wide-eyed. "Sir, your daughter. She isn't here." Julian stood up so quickly that his chair fell to the floor. "What do you mean by missing?" His voice sounded cool, but the way his shoulders were tense said otherwise. "She's not at work. The door was slightly open. We looked in the parking lot, the restrooms, and every hallway. Nothing." Julian didn't think twice. He shoved his staff aside and sprinted up the steps 2 at a time. The office was just as he had left it, quiet and untouched. The sketchpad was still open on the table. 2, though. There is only one drawing on the page, a server holding a tray, and a girl next to her. His heart sank. He yelled orders into his ear. Lock the building down. Look at all the security feeds. Tell all the managers. For the first time in years, Julian wasn't a CEO. He was a scared father whose daughter, the most important person in his life, had disappeared from his own restaurant. Staff members rushed around downstairs with radios and concerned looks on their faces. Guests kept eating, not knowing that a tempest was building behind the scenes. Then a hostess went up to him and pointed past the wine bar. She's there. Julian turned around. That was when he first saw her. Not hiding, not gone, but standing, putting on a big apron, holding a pitcher of water. Next to Naomi. Working, laughter. Julian stayed still. His feet stayed where they were, but his heart fell apart. This wasn't a missing person case. It was something new. When Julian finally saw Alara again, he had thought about every potential result. Crying, fear, a scared girl huddled up in a corner, scared of the noise and the people she didn't know. That was how things generally went in public. That was what the experts told him to watch out for. Alara didn't like things that were unpredictable. Especially not in a restaurant with the smell of grilled meats, the sound of glasses clinking, and people talking. But what he saw was not what he had expected. Alara was standing up straight, with a calmness he had never seen before. She clutched a polished water pitcher with her hands. It wasn't exactly still, but it was on purpose. Like a mirror in training, she stood next to Naomi and copied all she did. Alara didn't see Julian until Naomi did. She didn't freak out. She didn't want anyone to like her. She smiled and said nothing. A pleasant, tranquil smile that said, "It's okay. She is secure here." Julian moved closer, slowly and carefully. The sound of his sneakers hitting the floor echoed. Alara turned a little, and he saw her out of the corner of her eye. He got ready for it. Alara didn't back down or give up, though. She did something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She nodded at Naomi, then smiled at her dad. A little smile. Only the edges of her lips were curving up. But Julian thought it was the sunlight. Naomi bent down to Alara's level and murmured something that was too quiet to hear. Alara nodded again, handed Naomi the pitcher, and stepped back, still serene and still there. Julian cleared his throat since he didn't know what to say. He whispered softly, I didn't know she left the office." Naomi looked to Alara and then back at him. "I was polishing silverware in the back when she came in. I didn't want to scare her, so I let her stay. She watched me work for a while. After that, she began to help. She's good at it." Julian blinked. "You mean she just came with you?" Naomi laughed softly. "No. She chose me." That sentence impacted him harder than he thought it would. Because it was true. Alara hadn't just walked into any portion of the restaurant. She had discovered someone. Someone she could trust. Someone who didn't want her to change. Someone who didn't look. Julian gazed at his daughter, who was still standing there with serene assurance. Her hands were now playing with the edge of her apron. This wasn't a fluke. This was the first time his daughter had ever really connected with someone outside of their home. And it had all begun with compassion. Without a plan, no treatment session. Two people just happened to find each other in the most unlikely spot. Julian has always thought that words were necessary for communication. That growth means clear goals, like saying phrases, talking to other people, and making eye contact. That's what the professionals stated. The charts kept track of that. If you missed a word, you failed. Every time it was quiet, it was a setback. But seeing Alara and Naomi together made him doubt everything. They didn't talk much, but they understood each other better than most people ever could. It all started with motions. Naomi glided effortlessly through her tasks, such as clearing plates, folding napkins, and filling drinks. Alara followed closely behind. She copied Naomi's actions like a silent echo, not to make fun of her but to show how much she admired her. Her steps were slower and more careful, but she was becoming better. And most importantly, she was there. Naomi never pushed her to hurry, never told her off in a mean way. Naomi grinned when Alara dropped a spoon. Naomi gently moved the water glasses back into place without saying anything when they were out of order. No anger. Don't worry. Just being there. That was the magic. Naomi was next to Alara and didn't ask her for anything. No queries have to be asked. No need to make eye contact. She didn't have to explain herself. And that's why Alara blossomed. She started giving Naomi silverware before she asked for it. She changed how she held the trays without being told to. At one point, she even took the lead and offered a guest a folded napkin. The guest blinked, astonished, but smiled and received it with a thank you. Alara's eyes shone like stars. Julian watched from a distance, his heart racing. He had never seen his daughter like this before, without fear and full of purpose. There was no breakdown, no panic attack, just calm happiness. The kind of joy that doesn't shout out but shines from inside. Naomi looked at him briefly, as if to see if it was okay for Alara to keep going. Julian nodded, his eyes glazed over. This was more than being nice. It was faith. In that instant, Julian realized what had been missing from every professional, program, and polished expert he had ever hired. People connect with each other. The kind that doesn't come with proof but with gut feelings. The kind that sees a person and not a problem. Naomi didn't try to fix Alara. She merely gave her space. Alara then walked into that place with all her heart. There were no big speeches, no new advancements in therapy. A girl with a guarded personality and a waitress with a bright soul find peace in the tranquil rhythm of working together. Sometimes, the most therapeutic things happen while no one is talking. It felt like the world had stopped for a bit, so that something lovely could happen. But serenity doesn't exist long in settings where people perform. It began with whispers. A couple beside the window, wearing nice clothes, watched Naomi and Alara go from table to table. The woman leaned in and said something rude behind her glass of wine. The dude didn't say anything back. He yelled, not to call the server, but to make a point. I didn't pay for a 5-star experience just to be served by a charity act? People looked. The room got colder, not because of the temperature, but because of the instantaneous pain that spread across the tables like broken glass. Naomi stayed in the same position. She didn't move. But Julian had already started to walk over from the other side of the room. Gregory, the restaurant's general manager, stopped him before he could get to them. Gregory murmured hurriedly, "Sir, I need to ask your daughter and Naomi to step aside." He kept his eyes down. "That guest is a platinum member of ours. He says he will file an official complaint." Julian looked at him. "Why? My daughter helping a staff member?" Gregory was unsure. "It's the optics, sir. This is new to people. A black server was followed by a girl who was clearly having problems with her behavior. They don't know what's going on, and it's unsettling the vibe, changing the mood." The remark hit Julian right in the chest. He looked past Gregory and saw Naomi and Alara standing by a table nearby, waiting for orders. Naomi's grin was still there, but her eyes spoke a different story, one that Julian understood. She had been made to feel like a problem before. Julian murmured softly, "I'll take care of it." He came right up to the table where the couple was sitting, looking smug and happy. Julian said, "Excuse me," in a quiet voice that was sharp enough to cut steel. "Is there a problem with your service tonight?" The man leaned back. "I just think it's unprofessional to be served by someone who doesn't belong in this kind of place." Julian turned his head. "You mean the black waitress or my daughter who has autism? Or do both of them violate your sense of luxury?" The woman's mouth dropped open. The man blinked. "You." Julian cut in. "I own this place. And I won't put up with bigotry. Not toward my employees, not to my child. You can finish your food if you like, but you can't talk to either of them again. The exit is right past the fountain if you're not comfortable. Be quiet." Everyone around had stopped pretending not to listen. Julian turned around and went back to Alara and Naomi. He just said, "You both are staying. Together, for as long as you wish." Naomi blinked in shock. Alara smiled and reached for Naomi's hand, not fully understanding what had just happened. Naomi gently massaged it. Owning a restaurant can sometimes give you influence. Sometimes it means keeping what's right inside it safe. Julian urged Naomi to stay for a moment later that night, after the last table had been cleared and the restaurant had faded to its gentle after-hours glow. They stood near the service bar, away from the linen-covered tables and clinking drinks that had made the day so crazy. Alara was close by, coloring on a menu and humming a song that only she could hear. Julian's eyes peered at Naomi in a way that was different from the usual guarded professionalism. They were full of real curiosity. "How did you do that? Why?" he inquired. Naomi looked like she didn't understand. "Do what?" He pointed to Alara. "She's never talked to anyone like that before, not without months of planned therapy. But still, she trusted you right away." Naomi looked down and ran her fingertips along the edge of the counter. She thought about it for a moment before speaking softly. "I don't talk about it very often. Not here, at least. People think that being a waitress is all you are." Julian didn't say anything. Naomi went on. "I was in school to become a speech and language pathologist. Concentrated on early intervention. My little brother Elijah started to get worse when I was midway through my master's degree. He was 4 years old. He sang the ABCs one day and then wouldn't look at us the next, wouldn't say anything, wouldn't eat some things. Everything happened so quickly." Julian nodded, fully aware of what was going on. Naomi stated, "We couldn't pay for private care. So I quit the program, got 2 jobs. I began reading every book I could get my hands on, watching videos of therapy, practicing methods at home. I wasn't certified, but I figured out how to get to him. Slowly." Her voice got softer. "He reacts to rhythm. He finds peace in doing the same thing over and over. When there is no pressure, he copies what others do. The same things I noticed in Alara when she walked into the kitchen." Julian blinked. "Why didn't you ever bring this up?" Naomi shrugged a little. "I didn't believe it was important, not till now." Julian then realized how deep Naomi's gift was. She hadn't helped Alara by chance or luck. She had met her, not as a diagnosis or a problem, but as a person who deserves patience. Julian replied in a low voice, "You saved her today." Naomi shook her head. "She saved me too." Julian looked over at Alara, who was still lost in her colors and at calm. Some people spend their whole lives trying to get degrees and fame. Some people, like Naomi, have wisdom that doesn't need to be framed on a wall to be true. She had made service into a safe place. And without ever saying so, it had been exactly what Alara needed all along. Julian Devereaux founded his restaurant empire on being exact. He was in charge of everything, from the mood and lighting to where the ingredients came from, and even the type of water supplied at each site. For a long time, Michelin stars and investor profits were the only things that mattered for success. But everything changed one day when he observed his daughter grin next to a waiter who was usually overlooked by everyone else. That night, Julian didn't get much sleep. He stayed up in his home office to watch the security footage of Alara and Naomi. He didn't just watch it once, he watched it over and over again, not to break down, but to get it. He could see that Alara's shoulders relaxed when she was around Naomi, how she followed without being afraid, how she looked up from the floor. He understood that no training program or expensive therapy had ever done that. No expert he paid $400 an hour had ever made his daughter look that calm. It wasn't a plan, it was the soul. And maybe, just maybe, his empire needed more of that. Julian made a choice the next week that stunned his board of directors. He said that all Devereaux restaurants would be starting an attempt to make everyone feel welcome, not to get good press, not as a tax deduction, but as a complete rethinking of what hospitality meant. Every place would start to offer training programs for youths and young people with neurodiversity. Some people would be in front of the camera, while others would be behind the scenes, depending on how comfortable they were. The program would be optional, based on trauma, and run by someone who knew the way better than anyone else. He asked Naomi if she wanted to be the director of inclusive training and development. She didn't believe him at first. She thought it was a sign or a headline. But Julian looked her in the eye and said, "You saw my daughter when no one else could. This program needs someone just like you." Naomi agreed, but not with pride. The first restaurant to try out the idea was the same one where it all started. Naomi collaborated with therapists and teachers to build training modules. She brought in families from the area who had kids like Alara. She made a place where people could be themselves and not hide their differences. And what about Alara? She was the first person to take part in the program. One afternoon, Julian strolled into the kitchen to see her instructing a new recruit how to fold napkins with accuracy. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence spoke everything. Devereaux's Prime stopped being just a luxury brand. It became a movement. Not founded on exclusivity, but on empathy. And the change wasn't loud. It was quiet, purposeful. The kind of change that starts with a single smile and spreads like warmth across frigid marble corridors. Something changed in Julian Devereaux's life in the months that followed. It wasn't just his restaurants. It was also his house, his heart, and how he saw the world. Ilara didn't change into a different youngster overnight. There were still days when words felt too weighty, still required peaceful places and routines that were easy to follow. But the girl who formerly lived behind walls was now constructing bridges slowly, lovingly, on her own terms. And Julian? He stopped judging success in expansion charts and quarterly reports. He started showing up, not only as a provider, but also as a dad. He began escorting Ilara into the restaurant each morning, not as a CEO parading a cause, but as a dad dropping off his daughter where she felt confident, where she felt noticed. Naomi's program got bigger. Other restaurant owners called and asked how they might copy the model. Families who had kept their kids hidden for a long time because they were afraid or ashamed started coming. They sat boldly at the front tables, knowing that this space was for them too. This time, the brand wasn't about being exclusive, it was about people. Julian often thought back to that initial moment, when Ilara stood next to a woman who wouldn't view her as broken, holding a pitcher of water and smiling beneath the bright lights. It taught him something easy that changed his life. Sometimes, the best ideas don't come from people who know a lot or have a lot of money. People that show up with empathy are the ones who come. With time, with no plans, just love. That's when mending starts, when someone finally looks at you and not around you or past you. Remember this story if you've ever felt like you were invisible or seen someone you love be misunderstood, misjudged, or written off. Not because it took place in a posh restaurant, but it can happen any place. It only takes one individual who is willing to look past the noise. Someone who says, "You belong here. You should be that person." And if this story made you feel something, even a little, share it. Someone out there has to be told that being different isn't bad. Different is just different. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs more of. This has been a Black story that is worth remembering. Thank you for watching. Be nice, stay human, and keep an eye out for more important articles.